Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining me on how Amazon Aurora helps you protect your data from mistakes. My name is Kathy Gibbs. I am a Migration Specialist Solution Architect here at AWS. We have a pretty jam-packed agenda, so we'll just jump right into it. We're going to start off by talking about the actual use cases that we run into with risk. We're going to talk about continuous backups first with point-in-time recovery, then the manual snapshot, and within manual snapshot, we'll take a moment to talk about AWS backup and how that works with manual snapshots. Then we're going to go into additional options and round out with fast clone and backtrack and how those can help you out. So let's go ahead and get started then. So what are these use cases that we're trying to avoid risk on? The first one that I have listed here is deletion of data. I certainly know that when I was a DBA, actually my lead called me one time, I was paged because he thought he was on development and deleted all of the data files. So accidental deletion hopefully is much more common than malicious, but we'll talk to both of those. We'll talk about issues with the release cycle. This is something that, QA can usually get to all of the release questions and test everything, but sometimes something slips through. So we're going to talk about how we can alleviate risk there. Double entry is pretty self-explanatory. If I'm loading data and something happens and maybe it gets stopped and then it starts again and doubles all of the rows. And then we'll finish up and we'll talk through disaster recoveries and failures and how each of these can help you if you do happen to have a disaster. So let's start with those continuous backup and talking about the point-in-time recovery. The first place you're really going to start when you're working with databases and you want to make sure that you're covered. So within AWS and within Amazon Aurora, I'm going to take just a second. We'll spend just a couple minutes talking about Aurora and how Aurora is a little bit different here. You can see that I have a primary instance. With Aurora, we have 6 copies of the data across 3 availability zones. So if you follow the colors, you can follow, I've got 2 in each one of those areas to total 6. So my primary instance, what happens is that when I write data, it writes down to each of those 6 copies, and it needs 4 of those 6 to come back and say, yep, I got it. And if it does, then it goes on its merry way. Okay. Once it's in that state, then you actually push backup data or log information and updating the backup to S3. So that's what this picture is showing. That's kind of a high level of how Aurora works there. By default, our continuous backup when you first install Aurora is going to be for 7 days. So it means that I can go back in time for 7 days and do a point-in-time recovery during that time. You can go up to a maximum of 35 days for that point-in-time recovery, and then we'll talk about how to add on manual backups after that to help you out, or if there was some place that you have to go back to if there was, say, a problem and you didn't catch it for a while. Okay, so the point-in-time recovery, although we certainly can use backups and do a restore to address all of our risks, whether it's accidentally deleting data or that disaster recovery, but most of the time, at least you'll see that this particular backup, doing that automated backup, the continuous backup, you'll use that for disaster recovery. So let's dive into a little bit more of what this means and how we can use this. So here is my screenshot. You saw on the previous page, and we mentioned that those backups go to S3, and that really talks to durability. So if I do have to recover, I know that my files are going to be there to recover to. Durability, S3 has 11 nines of durability, so that data is going to be there, your backup will be there. So we'll talk to Aurora, and on our next slide, I have a really good picture that shows it, but at a high level, Aurora does backups different. So there isn't actually a time, an exact, this is when we start our backup. Aurora is constantly backing up your data. So whether it's saving and committing the data to a durable disk or through the logs, it's constantly doing that. And so that's going to help you go out quite a bit when you talk about recovery. Okay, so we talked to all of those. This is the slide I was talking to that I wanted to make sure that we went over. So what happens with Aurora? You can see here that we do have a recovery point. So you have a point when all of those segments, again, this is 3 of them, but we have 6 copies on Aurora. So all of those segments will take a recovery point. And that's what this dotted line is showing. During that time or after that, there's data that's running, right? So through the segments, you can see each of those little boxes are log records. And throughout this time, each segment might have a snapshot. So I'm doing data and then I do a snap, right? And then I've got log data and then I do a snap. So each of these segments can be recovered independently in parallel. All right, so that's one of the ways that it speeds up recovery and how Aurora is different. All right, so got my recovery point, I've got my snapshot. Once I have that segment snapshot, I'm just using those log records to recover that one particular segment. Okay, so another way to show this is kind of how this works with crash recovery, right? So if I have one transaction, so I've got my transaction, I've got my beginning and then my commit. What happens is I've got logs, right? So it writes to the log. I haven't pushed that down. It's kind of checkpoint, although Aurora doesn't do checkpointing in the same way. We'll use that checkpoint verbiage because of how it works on commercial databases. So I've got my second transaction, it starts and then it commits after the checkpoint. So my quote unquote checkpoint, or when data is put on durable storage, I've got it there, but I also have a log because that transaction isn't committed yet. Then I've got my third transaction. We can see this is over in green. And then I have my fourth. That's where my system failure is. So the red is actually blue over here. It means it didn't commit. So it has some of that log information, but it wasn't fully committed. So what ends up happening in that system failure is that, yeah, I start with my checkpoint, but transaction 2 and transaction 3 are actually redone by that redo procedure using those logs, okay? And they're redone up to the checkpoint. Transaction 4, because it wasn't committed, is undone. So it's not going to save when you are doing a recovery. So this is a system recovery. Again, we're talking about kind of that last bullet first, because we want to make sure that we've got that failover, that disaster recovery, that's going to be able to make sure that your database stays up. Okay, so we talked about restoring. This is the GUI when you look at it when I'm going to restore the backup. So restoring, I can go to the last restorable time, or I can do custom. Most of the time we're going to do custom because last restorable, I'm not really, if there's a failure, I want to go to before the failure. And sometimes I may not know for 5-10 minutes that there was a failure or that there was data that was lost, right, in that particular example. So the one thing to remember that if you are doing a restore, that it will create a new instance. So a lot of people will, if I'm looking in that example for, let's say I duplicated data, right, my risk factor. So I want to restore the data. I'll restore the instance, and again, it creates a new instance, and I'll take that data from the new instance and put it back into the old instance, which is actually still my production. Okay, so yes, there are times when you're going to restore and then use that new instance as your new production, but it's good to keep in mind that when you restore, it's not in place and it will have new endpoints when you do that. Because it is a new instance, you can use this to change your storage type, change different things about the instance that you have. But one thing to note is that your default parameter group, security group, and options group will go back in play. So we're not going to get too much into those particular groups, but it is good to know that it will go back to default. So if you've changed this and used a custom, say for you want to increase the number of processes and you're using a custom parameter group to do that, you're going to need to reassign that custom parameter group to the new instance if you are going to use that. Okay. So you can see down here the instance class, what I can change. I can make it bigger. I can make it smaller. I can also use command line interface scripts. So I don't have to use the GUI. I can use those CLI commands and script everything out so that if there is a disaster during that very stressful time, you've already got everything scripted out and you just need to change times or particular small details, right, that you've tested out. Okay, so let's go into, I've got my continuous backup manual snapshots as we talked about. So what is that manual snapshot, especially in comparison to the continuous backup? Well, manual snapshot is, as it says, it's manually created. You can create that through the AWS console, or you can create it through the command line or an API as well. That may be another software application such as Jenkins. If you want to use that, you can use that to create an API to create a backup. We can also use those calls to use AWS Backup to manage and monitor these manual snapshots, but we'll get into that in a couple. So manual snapshots are kept until you delete them. That means we do not delete them. So it's something to be aware of, that if you're taking a manual snapshot every 2 hours and you keep those for 10 years, that's going to have a lot of storage costs, and we're not going to delete any of those for you. So you can see, we'll talk about that in AWS Backup, where you can have a schedule to kind of roll those over, or maybe you don't need them after, say, 3 years. Okay. Why would you use a manual snapshot? Well, besides the reasons that people use it, such as maybe I want to make a clone or I want to have an extra copy, a manual snapshot is really good to use right before that release cycle that we were talking about. So I can use this, let's say I'm loading data at the end of the quarter. I'd want to create a manual snapshot right before I load, so that if I do find a problem, I can go back in time when I know that everything was running okay. Okay. And again, with this, just like with the continuous backup, it is going to restore to a new instance, a new cluster with new endpoints. Okay, so I mentioned that you can use the command line interface, the CLI. This is just an example of how you do that. It's a very straightforward, very simplistic. So you use the command create DB cluster snapshot, and you can see down here below that what I'm doing is identifying my cluster and then identifying what I want to call my snapshot. Okay, so I can do this through the command line. I can create it programmatically, and I can schedule this to run as I want to. All right, using it with different APIs as well. But another thing I can use this for, if we go ahead and click through, is I can create a command line scripting out cross-region copying. And what that means is I can take a manual snapshot and I can move that snapshot to another region. So we've got that kind of before with the manual snapshot, we were taking care of the risk where maybe I had the wrong information or duplicate data into disaster recovery. So if there's a true disaster, I've got my snapshot that I can recover in a different region. You can even do this even programmatically if your database is encrypted, but you will need to know what each key is in each region, as a key is specific to a particular region. Okay? All right, so let's go ahead and talk about the next option that we have, and that's cross-account copy. Now, I just wanted to mention this to make sure that you have that there. There may be an account that you want to store just a master so that you always can go back at a beginning time, and I want to put that in a different copy, maybe a pristine account that I put everything in. So you can use a manual snapshot and you can copy it to another account. Often people use this with, some people have production in one account and development in another account. So this is used commonly that way, but you can use it to help out your risk, as is, again, before I have a release, I'm going to put this in my pristine copy or my pristine account where I have everything. And here's your CLI command to make that happen. If you don't have this copy of the presentation, these are very easy to find if you just search the website. All right, so I mentioned before talking about AWS Backup and manual snapshots. So what is AWS Backup? AWS Backup launched in January of 2019, and what it does is it's a central management and automation for backups across services and across your accounts. Okay, so here's my backup. I can not only back up EBS, EFS if I want that file system, as well as the databases, the Amazon RDS, of which Aurora is a part of. So what does backup give you? Well, as I mentioned, it has the centralized backup. But what that also gives you is compliance. I've got one place where I look at for compliance for my backups, as well as automation and just control, right? So I've got that monitoring, that security, and then that automated lifecycle, like I talked about. Maybe you don't want 10 years, maybe you want 3 years. So you can set that up and you don't have to do that per instance or per type of instances. You can do that in AWS Backup. And then again, across multiple services, it does work. So I can have one application and back up everything all in the same timeline. So how you set up, the first thing you do with AWS backups is you want to set up AWS organizations. Now you're probably already familiar with this, but this means I've got my master organization, and if I do have multiple accounts, then it's all under that master, or I can connect, I can see all of those accounts. So AWS backup works with AWS organizations to make sure that, hey, I can back up everything that's in my org, not just one particular account. Okay, so you'd want to set that up first if you have those organizations. Again, that's going to give me policy and tag based. So why I put this in here is if I tag everything, if I say, okay, the name is production, or the name is tier 1, or the name is dev, then I can group those together, as we'll see coming up with vaults, and it will help me manage and monitor the different backup systems. You can even do it by application if you want to. Okay, so go ahead and go to the next page. One of the things we talked about is, or that I mentioned, is that you do have governance and security, and we'll talk about that here in the next slides, where the governance of it and the compliance, you're not having to, as a corporation, monitor every DBA that is setting up backups. You have one place that you can monitor and manage and alert off of all of your backups, and again, even doing those tiers if you group it that way. It just makes it much more simple. And again, then you can control the lifecycle and you can control the security around that across those systems, as we see over here on the left. Okay, so a vault, you can have a vault within AWS backup. And what that does is that groups like systems together. So as I was mentioning, you can put together tags like maybe production, or maybe this application is our accounting application, and everything that's a part of it can go together in a vault. And then what you can do there is you can limit or grant access, right? My access and my permissions. So how I access AWS backup, can I select it? Can I create a backup? Can I delete the backup? Same as the permissions, right? That's on there. You can also have each vault have its own notification, such as if I've got production, I may want to be notified much more frequently than I do for dev. Maybe I don't care as much. I just want an email. Okay. I can customize this for those permissions. And again, one of the really cool things is that if I created an AWS backup, I can't delete it anywhere else. So I can set up my granular access in AWS backup, and even though people can see the backups, maybe in actually looking in the GUI underneath my particular instance, I can't I can't delete that. Okay. So again, high level before we dive into how do we do that. I've got my backup, I create my plan across my services, and then I can monitor, modify, restore, report, all from AWS backup. Okay, so after I've got my vault, the next is a plan. So I can create the plan and use the same plan across many databases, many instances, many servers actually, where I can have the life cycle, I can have the expiration, and we'll see that. And within those, I can either at the plan level, as well as the vault, create IAM roles where people can see these backups, what I can do with them. Okay, so first step, what I do is I'm going to create that backup plan. So I can either start with an existing plan or I can build that new plan. So if I've got production or a new development or something like that, I create my new plan. Right? I've got templates that I can use, and we'll see some of the things you can set up here on this slide. So how often do I back it up? Right? What's my rule name? What's the window that I do for backing this up? Is it at 2 in the morning? You know, when that would be. Then what I can do is I can use that life cycle as far as how long do I keep this. The transition to cold storage is actually just for EFS. It's not for the databases now. So when it talks about that, but like expiry, you can set that, and retention and how long I want to keep that. And then you can say which backup vault, which vault is it a part of. You can also use APIs. And the reason we say this is that not only can you create using APIs, using these different actions, and there's over 40 of them, we have a lot of partners that have used these APIs. So if you already have a backup program, you may be able to continue using that backup program and link it through APIs with AWS Backup. Okay, this is an example of another way you can set this up. So I can use AWS Backup, and I can create a CloudFront script within AWS. So CloudFront, I can reuse this kind of that content delivery. I can create the script and then reuse it and call it when I'm creating a new backup. Okay, I can put the backup, I can put the recovery in there. So it's just an example of what that would look like, and another way that you can use that code to be able to restore your data and make sure that you're not losing your data when you have one of these risk factors. Okay, so we talked about the secure, we've talked about some of these, but who can access recovery points is really important, because I probably want everybody or a lot of people to be able to create backups and have some control or reporting, so I know that's not going crazy. But I probably don't want hardly anybody to be able to delete a backup, right? So I can put those recovery points, I can put that permission on my vault, on my particular backups, and separate the duties, right? And be much more aware of those separation of duties for, say, a SOX audit or something like that. So each vault can have its own notification, and we'll see that coming up on the next screen. So this is differentiating, right? So I told you that you can look and see the backups in the instance. I can go into all of my backups. You can tell by the description which backup is coming from AWS Backup and which one is just coming through if I go through the console. Here, my description, right? My snapshot's created by AWS Backup Service, right? Or is it just a backup job? So I can see that in description. But another thing I can do, as I mentioned, I'm going to show you here, is that you can't delete this. So I'm in the console here under those EC2 events. I'm looking at one particular snapshot and I say, oh, I don't know that I need that. I've got another one that's happening right about the same time. So I'm going to delete it. So I will click on that and try to delete it. It'll say, are you sure? And you'll say, yeah, I want to go ahead. It won't let you. Okay. So I have to have not only permissions in AWS to do that, but you have to be an AWS backup to delete that backup. So it helps you from a security standpoint of who is going to get in there, and really kind of furthers that conversation around that malicious loss of data or a malicious problem that's happening where maybe you have somebody that has access to those DBA permissions, but in this case, I'm not going to let them delete that snapshot because it was created in AWS backup. Okay, so this is Backup Vault. I can see all the different recovery points, right? So we talked about that you can put permissions on this as well. You've got an access policy, right? So I'm using IAM as I mentioned. And in this case, I've got the deny, and I can see delete recovery point. So I'm not going to let that happen for EC2 in these particular regions, right? For my Dynamo, for my backups, for RDS. So I've got those policies that's assigned to my vault. So then when I go in and I want to try to delete a recovery point, because, hopefully not malicious, but a lot of times that's what that is, it will tell me I can't do that because I don't have access to that IAM policy. So just showing you some of the things we talked about and how that looks, and the fact that it does in fact stop you from doing all of that unless you have permissions. The last one we kind of talked about is reporting and alerting on this. So that's that SNS, that notification service. So I can say on this particular job, or I want this topic to do events when it was restored. So when that job started to restore it, when it completed, and then also, hey, when is that recovery point modified? Okay, so this is just an example that you use, but you can do a lot of the alerts, and then I can keep a report on that and find out, hey, this particular restore took 5 times longer than it normally does. What's going on, right? I have that in there. But it allows me to then get an alert. So if somebody is trying to do that malicious, they deleted that data, and then they want to delete the backup of it so you can't recover, you'll get alerted when somebody's even trying to do that. Okay, so we talked about the backups, and obviously, me being a former DBA, backups are very important, and recovery even more so. But we have a couple other features in Aurora that will really help you to mitigate some of those risk factors. Okay, and that's going to be fast clone and backtrack. So the first one I'm going to talk about is fast clone. Fast database cloning is actually my favorite of the Aurora, what we can do in Aurora, because it can do so many things. So what you do when you have a fast clone is you've got your production instance, you can create a cloned instance, but you will not create all of the storage. The clone is pointing back to the production storage. And so the only thing you're charged for when you talk about clones, and you can have 15 of them in this region, in this configuration, is that I just am paying for the instance. So I can have it there. Yeah, I can create blue-green deployments. I can do all kinds of things with fast clone, as we'll see. I can reorganize my database. I can create an index and see how it works. I can do performance tuning on that clone. I'm not putting anything new, except for if I create an index, that would be the only storage that I would have. So I'd only be paying for the storage of that new index, not a duplication of the full database. But if you notice down here, the last point, this is why I've included, because I have several customers that what they will do is they'll create, through scripting, a fast clone every 15 minutes. And they'll keep 4 of them on hand. So they'll delete, the last 5th one, and they'll create a new one. And what that allows for you is that if I did happen to have deletion of data or a mistake, I can go to that fast clone that was 15 minutes ago instead of having to do a full point-in-time recovery. It's a lot faster. It already exists there. And then I can just move the data that was good before the data was deleted. So it gives me that extra level of protection. And it's, as I mentioned down here it's much, much faster than having to recover the entire database into a new instance and then moving the data. I just go to that fast clone. It's a completely different instance. I log into it and I export or I move the data back into production. Okay, so we'll see this a little bit more than this picture. Let's dive a little bit deeper into how it works. So you can see here I've got my source database and my clone database, and right now they're all sharing the same storage. So that's what the orange is that they're looking at the same storage, okay? So they're referencing the same amount, and what happens? Well, the database is right now, since I haven't added any data, I have no additional storage on my clone. A little teeny bit, right, to create the instance, but I'm not paying for duplicate storage. The only time I start doing that is when I update data. So I've updated this particular page here on the source and page 5, right? So what ends up happening on the clone side is at the same time, I've updated page 2, 5, and 6. So what ends up happening is that, well, my clone database still needs that original 2. So I keep that, right? That's additional storage there. But on my source, I've got a page 2 that's updated. So that's the only time that I'm paying for that additional storage, or anytime I'm paying for storage on the clone is when I'm updating data. All right, so how do I create a clone? Well, this is the GUI. I can certainly do that, as I think I mentioned earlier, through a command line. But you just go into Actions and create a clone, and then you'll see that is what it just creates a clone. It usually does it within less than a minute, so you'll have that clone up and running. So this is my source screen up at the top, and it says there I've got about 40 million rows in a particular table. But when I look at, and in this case, that's the only table that's in this database, right? But if I look at my clone copy, that space is nothing. So I'm not duplicating that data. The only space that I have is what's needed there to run the instance, but I'm not going to update or use any more space, as I mentioned, until I do something. Update, add more rows, something like that. So now I've updated, right? So now I've come into the clone, I've updated those rows, 10 million additional rows, and now instead of 0.2, now it's up to 1.2 gigs. So that's when you're going to see the space that's increasing. But a lot of customers, for our particular risk assessment, if I'm just doing this to make sure I have my data, I'm not even going to add more storage. Again, the only cost that I'm going to have is that particular instance cost. So let's go into Backtrack lastly. So Backtrack is a way to bring the database quickly backwards to a point in time. So it's very quick when it happens. It's with, again, less than 30 seconds to do this, but you're not going to have to restore the database. So if it's a very quick thing, oh, I made a mistake 2 hours ago, let's go back and update that data, or let's get the good data from 2 hours ago because I just made a mistake. Right, so if I'm not using the fast clone, I can use Backtrack and set that up. So we're going to go in. There's my time at T1. I'm saying, oh, there was a particular problem. The one thing to note is that after I do this, the data will be invisible. So it's very important to think about when you backtrack. And I actually recommend that if you're going to do a backtrack, you actually have a small downtime and you get the users out of the system, because you can end up, although you can backtrack as many times as you want, which is really good for testing, backtrack, back, test, backtrack. For production, you'd want to get users out of the system, get that good data, and then bring that back up. But you certainly can rewind and do that multiple times. So here you can say I've got 10,000 rows at that state. Oh, I made a mistake. I'm going to go back in, Actions Backtrack. I'm going to go to that particular time. And now I go back to where my data is. Okay, so we talked about those risk use cases and how you can help, how you can mitigate those risks on top of just using backups, especially using fast clone, and how you can use Backtrack to help you out. I would say there's a couple related sessions if you're really interested in this, wanting to find out more things about Aurora. You can do DAT 201, 301, or 302, and I recommend you do that. And I thank you very much, and certainly ask that you complete the survey and enjoy the rest of reInvent.